It is past midnight on the Eastern Front, and a German soldier on the line hears something he has learned to be afraid of. Not the roar of an engine, the opposite of that. A soft, whispering hush, like a broom sweeping across the sky, like wind through a canvas sail. By the time he understands what it is already too late. The bombs are already falling. He looks up, and he cannot see them. He never can. He just hears that sound, and then the explosions walking across his camp, and then nothing. And in the morning, when his officers ask what happened, he says the only thing that makes sense to him. He says they were witches, night witches, women who fly without engines and drop fire out of the dark. He is half right. They are women. The engines are real. And almost everything else about how the world would come to remember them is going to get simplified, softened, and shrunk down, until the truth of what these people actually survived gets buried under a nickname. So tonight, let's go up into that dark with them, because the legend calls them the Night Witches, and it's a wonderful story. But the real story, the documented one, is harder, colder, and far more astonishing than the nickname lets on. And the women who lived it deserve to be more than a spooky name a frightened enemy gave them. Let's start with where they came from, because that part already breaks the usual picture. In 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The scale of it is almost impossible to hold in your head. The largest land invasion in human history, millions of men, thousands of miles of front. The Soviet Union was bleeding manpower at a rate no country could sustain. And across the country, Soviet women were demanding to fight. Not to nurse, not to type. To fight, most of those requests were refused. But there was one person in a position to change that, and her name was Marina Raskova. And if you don't know that name, that's exactly the problem this channel exists for. Because in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, Marina Raskova was as famous as anyone alive. She was a record-setting long-distance pilot, the Soviet Amelia Earhart, except more decorated and in her own country, more of a household name. She had personal access to Stalin himself, and she used it. Raskova petitioned the Soviet High Command to let her form combat regiments flown, navigated, armed, and commanded entirely by women. And in October of 1941, with the Germans closing on Moscow, the order came down. She was authorized to create 3 all-female air regiments. 3 fighter pilots, conventional bombers, and night bombers. This had never been done. Not at this scale, not anywhere. The one we're following tonight became the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. Later, for their service, they were given the honorific title of the 46th Guards. And from the very beginning, almost nothing about them matched the picture you might have in your head of a wartime air unit. Start with the people. These were not seasoned military aviators because there almost weren't any female ones to draw from. These were students, factory workers, school teachers, flying club instructors. Many of them were teenagers, 17, 18, 19 years old. Young women who a year earlier had been studying for exams or working a lathe, and who now volunteered to fly into anti-aircraft fire in the dark. They were rushed through a compressed training program in the town of Engels, on the Volga. Work that would normally take years was crushed into months. They learned to fly, navigate, drop bombs, and read the night sky on a brutal schedule, and then they were sent to the front. And the front did not care that they were new, and it did not care that they were women. And neither at first did their own side. This is a part that rarely makes the legend. When these women arrived at the front, a lot of the men around them did not take them seriously. They were treated, by some, as a novelty, a publicity stunt, a problem to be tolerated. They were issued men's uniforms and oversized boots because nothing had been made for them. They had to prove, mission by mission, that they belonged in the sky at all. And the way they answered that doubt was not with words. It was with sorties. Thousands and thousands of them. It is also worth saying who kept these planes flying, because they are even more forgotten than the pilots. The regiment's ground crews, the mechanics, and the armorers were women too. In the freezing dark, in mud and snow, it was women loading the bombs by hand onto the racks, refueling, patching bullet holes in fabric wings, turning each plane around in minutes so it could fly again. A busy night meant lifting and hanging thousands of pounds of bombs, by hand, over and over, with bare fingers in sub-zero cold. The pilots got the nickname. The armorers got frostbite and aching backs and almost no mention at all. Now here is the part of the real story that the nickname completely hides. The aircraft. Because when you hear bomber, you are probably picturing something heavy and armored and bristling with guns. Forget all of that. The plane these women flew was a Polikarpov Po-2, and the Po-2 was a 1920s biplane, a flimsy two-seater built of plywood and fabric, designed as a basic trainer and a crop duster. It was, quite literally, a wood and canvas plane built to teach beginners how to fly, and they took it into combat against the most mechanized military on Earth. Sit with what that actually means. The wings were fabric stretched over a wooden frame. There was no armor plating to stop a bullet. For most of the war, there was no radio to call for help, and there were no parachutes carried on the early missions, a decision that meant if you were hit, you went down with the plane. The cockpit was open to the freezing night air. The crew was two, a pilot in front, a navigator behind who also aimed and released the bombs. And the bombs were carried on simple racks slung right under those plywood wings. The plane was so light and so slow that it created its own bizarre tactical problems and its own bizarre advantages. It was so slow that it actually flew below the stall speed of the German fighters sent to hunt it, meaning a modern fighter could barely fly slowly enough to even aim at it without falling out of the sky. It flew low, it flew quiet, and it was so simple it could land in a field and take off again from almost anywhere. But slow and flimsy and unarmored also means something darker. It means this was as close to flying a target as a human being can do on purpose. So how do you attack a defended position in a wooden trainer with no armor? You do something that sounds insane until you understand the logic of it. The signature tactic of the Night Witches was this. As they approached the target, they would cut their engine. They would idle it back and let the plane glide in silent toward the German positions in the dark, with nothing but the wind over the wings. That was the whispering, broom-like sound the soldiers described. It wasn't witchcraft. It was a plywood biplane gliding in with its engine off so the enemy wouldn't hear it coming until the bombs were already released. Then they'd drop their bombs, restart the engine, and claw their way back up and home. And because the little plane could only carry a tiny bomb load, just a few small bombs at a time, one raid was never enough, so they flew again, and again, and again all night long. And it's worth being clear about what all of this was actually for, because the plywood plane makes it easy to underestimate. This was harassment bombing, and harassment bombing is not a gimmick. Night after night, these crews hit supply dumps, rear positions, vehicle parks, encampments, and crossings. But the deeper weapon was the dark itself, an enemy who knows that small, silent planes will come every single night, that the bombs can fall at any hour, from a machine he cannot hear and cannot see, does not sleep, he stays under cover. He keeps his lights off and his head down and his nerves stretched thin for weeks on end. Exhaustion is a real military effect, and a soldier who hasn't truly slept in a month is a soldier who fights worse the next day. That was the point, not just the craters, the fear and the sleeplessness delivered in a wood and canvas trainer. And this is the number that should stop you. On a busy night, a single crew could fly 8, 10, 12 sorties. Not in a war, in a single night. Land, rearm, take off, glide in, drop, come back, land, rearm over and over until the sky started to lighten. Over the course of the war, the regiment is documented to have flown something on the order of 23,000 to 30,000 combat sorties. With a few dozen crews, in plywood biplanes. Picture the routine of it. You take off into the cold and the dark. You navigate by landmarks and dead reckoning, freezing in an open cockpit. You approach a target ringed with anti-aircraft guns and searchlights. You cut your engine and you glide into all of it in total silence, completely exposed, with no armor and, early on, no parachute. You release your bombs, and then you turn around, fly back, land, and immediately get in line to do it again, knowing the enemy is now awake and waiting. And you do that 8 times before sunrise. One of those women has a name you should know. Nadezhda Popova. She flew with the regiment from early on and survived the entire war, and by its end she had flown hundreds of these night missions. By her own account and the regiment's records, on one ferocious night she flew as many as 18 sorties, 18 times into the dark in a single night. She was shot down more than once and walked back. She became a hero of the Soviet Union, and she was not a comic book figure. She was a young woman who kept climbing back into a plywood plane because the work wasn't finished. Multiply her by a regiment, and you start to see the real shape of this thing. The searchlights deserve their own moment, because this is where the real courage gets almost unbelievable. German anti-aircraft crews learned the Po-2's tricks, and one of the deadliest things they could do was catch one of these planes in a searchlight beam, because a slow wood and fabric biplane pinned in a cone of light is a perfect helpless target. So the women developed a counter tactic that tells you everything about what they were willing to do. They flew in groups, and they would deliberately use one aircraft as bait. That plane would fly in to draw the searchlights and the flak onto itself, twisting and diving to hold the enemy's attention, while the others slipped through the dark to the target. Then they'd switch. The bait became the bomber, and someone else took a turn being the target. They took turns being the bait. The cost of all this was exactly what you'd fear. This was not a safe assignment dressed up by propaganda. Over the course of the war, the regiment lost members, pilots and navigators killed in action, shot down in flames in those fabric planes that burned fast and gave you nowhere to go. More than 30 of these women died flying these missions. And remember what they were flying. When a plane made of plywood and doped canvas is hit by a tracer round, it doesn't just take damage, it catches fire. And in the early war, with no parachute, the crew had no way out at all, and yet they kept flying. Here is a detail that makes the 588th almost unique. Of Raskova's 3 regiments, this was the one that stayed entirely female from the first day to the last. The others, over time, took in men. This one did not. From the mechanics in the mud to the navigator in the rear seat to the commander who signed the orders, it remained, start to finish, a regiment of women, and it flew, in one form or another, until the end of the war in Europe, bombing German positions all the way to the outskirts of Berlin. They flew through 1942, 43, 44, into 1945. Some individual women flew hundreds of these night missions. A few flew more than 800 sorties each. Read that again. 800 times, some of these women took a wood and fabric trainer into defended airspace at night and glided in silent over the guns. So let's do the honest accounting, the part this channel is actually for. The legend gives us the Night Witches, a chilling, almost supernatural nickname handed to them by frightened German soldiers. And it's catchy, and it's even respectful in its way. But notice what the nickname quietly does. It turns them into ghosts, into something spooky and magical and not quite real. It takes the most documented, deliberate, repeated act of courage you can imagine, thousands upon thousands of sorties in plywood planes, and it files the whole thing under a campfire story. The truth is the opposite of supernatural. The truth is almost unbearably human and concrete. It's a 19-year-old former schoolteacher, freezing in an open cockpit, cutting her engine over an enemy artillery position for the 11th time that night, with no armor and no parachute, gliding in silence into the searchlights so the plane behind her can live. There's nothing magic in that. There's something much rarer. There's the deliberate, clear-eyed decision to do the most frightening thing imaginable, and then to turn the plane around and do it again. And these were not anonymous witches. They were specific people with names. Marina Raskova, who built the regiments and who died in 1943 in a flying accident, and was given the first state funeral of the war. Yevdokia Bershanskaya, who actually commanded the 588th in combat through the entire war. One of the very few women to command a combat air regiment in the whole conflict, and to lead it from the front. Nadezhda Popova and the others who flew into that dark hundreds of times each, and the women of that regiment became, between them, holders of the Soviet Union's highest honors for valor. More than 20 of them decorated as heroes of the Soviet Union, the country's top award for courage, not for being a legend, for what the records show they actually did, night after night, in a wooden plane. So why did so many of us grow up hearing the nickname but never the names? Part of it is the simple gravity of the Eastern Front in Western memory, an entire colossal war, fought and largely won at staggering cost, that often gets reduced to a footnote. Part of it is that a spooky nickname travels easily, and a list of teenage schoolteachers flying 23,000 sorties does not fit on a poster. And part of it, honestly, is that witches is a more comfortable story than the real one. A ghost story asks nothing of you. The real story asks you to actually picture that cockpit, and that searchlight, and that 19-year-old's hand on the throttle, choosing to cut the engine. That's the mechanism this channel keeps finding, over and over. The legend isn't usually a lie, it's a shrinking. It takes something almost too big and too brave to look at directly, and it gives you a smaller, easier version you can hold without flinching. The night witches weren't witches. That was the enemy's word, born of fear, for something he couldn't see and couldn't stop. The real word is harder. The real word is just women. Students and factory workers and teachers, most of them barely out of childhood, who climbed into plywood and canvas and flew into the dark over and over until the war was won, and far too many of whom never came back down. They flew without armor. They flew at first without parachutes. And for decades, they flew under a nickname that made them sound like a ghost story instead of the bravest pilots of the entire war. The least we can do is learn their names and look up into that dark and finally hear what that whispering sound really was.